Good evening, everybody. Well, I guess it's not really evening for some of you. I guess it's mid-afternoon if you're on the West Coast, 4 o'clock. But here in the heartland in Kansas City, Missouri, home of the Kansas City Chiefs, it is 6 p.m. And it's a little chilly here. It's 30 degrees. And my heart rate has finally returned to normal, if any of you are football fans. I'm sitting here in my Chiefs gear. And yeah, after the game Sunday, when the two teams scored 23 points in the last, I think it was 1 minute and 50 seconds or something like that. There was a lot of angst in the Kansas City area, but you know what? We got through it. We're on to the AFC Championship game this weekend, and because it's chilly outside, we decided to call this seminar, about warming up in the winter. And that's because we're going to talk about a new bulk fill material from Voco tonight called Viscolor. And it has to do with heat. And we'll talk about this as we get going. Hopefully you're all ready. We'll wrap this up in an hour. And then I'll let you guys get on and, get on to your part of the world and what you want to do for the rest of the weekend. So with that being said, let's get rolling. First of all, I want to really thank Voco for promoting and sponsoring this lecture. If it wasn't for the good folks at Voco, we wouldn't be here tonight. They were kind enough to put some sponsorship dollars to this and to help out with it. And they're also the ones that have this pretty amazing material that we're going to be talking about tonight. I want you all to know on a webinar like this that if you do have problems, reach out to Viva Learning. I don't have any control over anything other than what I'm talking about. So unfortunately, if things go wrong on your end, please reach out to Viva Learning. And the one other little thing I want to say is I want to say thank you to all of you because we're all busy in the world. And, I like to say that we all vote with our calendars and our watches. And I know that there's things that probably all of you would rather do than sit and listen to me talk tonight for an hour. And so I am truly, truly honored that you have chosen to spend some time with me. And I want to provide you with some good information that will not only benefit you, but will benefit your patients as well. One other quick little housekeeping thing is when I'm live in front of people and you can see me, if I stop and get a drink of water, it's pretty obvious. But when you can't see me in a situation like this webinar, if things go quiet for a couple of seconds before you think that perhaps you've dropped the connection to the webinar, give me just a second. Chances are that I'm probably just taking a sip of water. So this little thing that happens, and unfortunately you can't see me drinking while we're here doing it this way remotely. But with those little housekeeping things taken care of, let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about bonded restorations because, bonded restorations are a huge part of what we do every day in dentistry, whether it's bonded indirects, which is what we're going to talk about, bonded indirects, which are a big part of all of our practices, then bonded directs, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. Why do we do bonded restorations? And I think most of us would say that the one thing that really drives us to do composites nowadays is the aesthetics. I've been practicing for several years now, unfortunately, and I was around in the time when there was amalgam, and I did a lot of amalgams at one point in my career. And I like to humorously say, but it is true, that when I would finish an amalgam restoration, nobody ever, looked in the mirror, because this was before intraoral cameras, but nobody looked in the mirror and said, hey, great silver filling. I like the way you put the contours in there, and you've got it really sculpted well. There's some secondary anatomy in there. And, if I ever got them to come back to actually polish them, nobody ever said, look at that mirror kind of sheen that you've, accomplished with that restoration. Nowadays, though, if you do a composite, and a lot of times to our eyes as practicing dentists, will do one and look at it and go, it's acceptable, but it's probably not, anything that I would write home about. If you take a picture of that and show it to your patient on a huge monitor, patients, even if the shade match for you as a practitioner isn't that great, you show that to the patient and the patient says, whoa, that is so incredible. It looks just like tooth structure. And you're thinking, well, your tooth is a C4 color and we did an A2 composite, but if you're happy with it. But anyway, yeah, patients like aesthetics. Patients like things that are white. One of the other things that I personally really love about composites is the conservative nature of the preparations. Composite doesn't require mechanical retention. And because of that, with composites nowadays, you can remove just the diseased or weakened tooth structure and leave everything else behind. One of the things that I always hated about amalgams was that you sacrificed good, healthy tooth structure because of the weaknesses of the material. That just doesn't happen anymore with composites. We're not doing traditional, two surfaces anymore. Most of us now are doing what I refer to as slot preps, where we're just prepping through the marginal ridge and removing the decay and then restoring that without taking a big chunk of the occlusal surface out of it. Dot preps on the occlusal surface, where we're just going in and removing just the area that's carious without running out all the grooves or blowing out the entire occlusal surface. And that's because composite restorations are more like tooth structure, and we can use that conservative nature to save more tooth structure for later. There's also adhesion. Without having to have mechanical retention, we can put things like veneers on teeth, composite veneers. You can bond to tooth structure without having that mechanical retention. And that's terrific. And that sort of goes hand in hand with this next bullet point of ability to repair. I love the fact that if a restoration chips, or perhaps you get a little, recurrent caries around a restoration that you've done, you don't have to go in and remove that entire restoration and sometimes then remove more tooth structure to accommodate for the repair. Now you can simply go in, if it's say it's a chipped composite, you can just roughen it up and bond right to it. If it's at a margin, you can go in and just create a little tiny area along the margin, take out the decay, and seal it back up with composite. One of the great things is composite bonds to composite. And so it allows us to do so much more conservative and tooth bank dentistry. I'm not sure who came up with that term. I've heard it several times in my career, and I wish I knew who came up with the concept of tooth bank dentistry. I'd like to thank them in person for that. But the whole concept is leaving more tooth for a rainy day. We don't have to sacrifice tooth structure anymore because of the limitations of our materials. And that is a great thing about adhesive dentistry. But the one thing I think about adhesive dentistry for most of us is that when they're going well, they go really well. But occasionally we'll get off on our technique, or we'll get off in the chemistry, or whatever it is. And suddenly then we all get in slumps. And I'm a huge baseball fan. I mentioned football when we started, and I love baseball too. And I really believe that life is a lot like baseball, and we can get in streaks and slumps. And I think streaks and slumps also run in with dentistry, where some weeks we come into the office and it seems like everything we do goes perfectly textbook according to plan. And then other weeks we come in and you don't even feel like you can tie your shoes right that week for whatever reason. And that does happen sometimes, I think, with composites, and whether it's our curing lights get off, or perhaps, our technique isn't as good, or perhaps it's the fault of, maybe some old materials or whatever. When you're doing bonded dentistry, when you're doing them and they're going well, they're one of the most rewarding and profitable procedures that you can do in the dental office. The problem is when problems arise, they can quickly become stressful. If you're doing a whatever the procedure is, and you get in one of those slumps and that, oh my goodness gracious, I just got a bad feeling this is going to be one of those situations where I'm going to do some composites. They just aren't going to be done to my liking, that they're going to have sensitivity or whatever. That leads to stress. And nobody likes stress in healthcare. The patients don't like it. The team members don't like it. I know for sure the doctors don't like it. So let's work tonight about trying to eliminate some of these problems that we all have. And what are those problems that sometimes show up in the realm of adhesive dentistry? Well, I think if you polled dentists, the number one thing that everybody would say was sensitivity. If I could change one thing about composite restorations, I would change the ability for them to cause sensitivity. And I'm no different at all. And I am going to discuss a little bit tonight on my technique and how I do things. And hopefully, I think I've really beaten the sensitivity monster pretty well in my years in dentistry. And hopefully tonight I can help you with that as well. But some of the other problems can be durability, and that can relate to things such as isolation and moisture contamination. Because if you can't control the field, you're going to have problems. Technique is incredibly important with any kind of adhesive dental procedures, whether it's a direct or an indirect. But it's really, really important in indirects, because indirects take time. And so I'm going to talk some tonight about ways to be efficient and control the field better. And that will help you deal with things like isolation and moisture. And there's also chemistry involved in here. Sometimes certain materials work better with certain other materials, and that's just the nature of the beast, and that's good to know. Having tissue and hemorrhage control is a huge advantage in this. It's much easier to place a two-surface composite restoration in a patient that's a category 1 prophy patient, as opposed to somebody that has perio disease. Maybe they don't have the best home care. You've got a proximal box that's fairly deep. You've got gums that are bleeding when you're working, and you're trying to prevent keeping the bleeding out of there. And it's a deeper box, so you've got to work on getting things down further, getting them cured, and that's a lot harder. So if you can manage to control the tissue and hemorrhage, that's better. And then the one thing that can really cause problems I've found in my career that people don't often consider is curing. The two biggest things that I find when I'm troubleshooting with other doctors is either technique, which goes down to isolation and controlling the field, or curing. And the reason is curing lights, oftentimes they decrease in output and we don't realize it, or maybe somebody doesn't have the proper curing technique. A lot of us have our dental assistants doing curing for us while we're doing this, and perhaps they don't know the right technique. But between the lights and curing technique, curing can really lead to a lot of problems. And if you have proper curing technique, then that will help solve a lot of these sensitivity problems as well. So what are the causes of sensitivity? Well, the biggest thing for me goes back to controlling the field, the biologic contamination, crevicular fluid, blood, and saliva. Those are the three banes to the dental existence when you're doing adhesive dentistry. One of the other things that a lot of people don't think about is oil contamination. Our hand pieces, when we sterilize them, in order to maintain them properly, they're being oiled before they go in the autoclave. And if you're not working to get that oil out of the hand pieces before you start a procedure, oftentimes as you start to prep, you're still blowing oil out. And if it's a small situation where it's a small prep and you're not going to be, running the handpiece for 5 or 10 minutes, that oil contamination can actually end up in your prep, and that can affect your bond strength. And obviously, weak bond strengths can then lead to sensitivity, breakdown in margins, restoration failure. A lot of problems can come from oil contamination if we're not aware of it. One of the things that I recommend to people is if you're upgrading your office or you're building a new office, go with an oilless compressor. If you happen to have an older compressor that actually requires you to put oil in it from time to time, always check the filters. There are filters in your air line as that line exits the compressor, and those filters help take moisture and oil out of that air. And a lot of people don't realize that those filters need to be changed on a regular basis. So the next time you've got someone in your office to either, repair something, or even just to do like routine preventive maintenance on some things, have that technician also look at your compressor if it requires that oil filtration, and make sure that those filters are working and they're up to date. One of the other things that can cause sensitivity is voids on the pulpal floor. A lot of times with composites can be a little sticky on the instruments. And as you place the composite and you're coming in with an instrument to kind of condense it down and get it evenly distributed in your prep, as you lift that instrument off of the material, sometimes that material will stick to that instrument. And oftentimes it's hard to notice. And when you pull up with that instrument, if you happen to just microscopically pull the composite up off of the pulpal floor of that preparation, you'll have a void down there. Even if you're doing incremental curing, if your first increment of 2 to 3 millimeters is pulled up off of the pulpal floor microscopically, what you end up with is a void there. And then when you load that restoration occlusally, when you're done and the patient goes home, the anesthetic wears off and they bite, that little void, when they load that restoration occlusally, that void, pressure gets on the void. That void then creates pressure across the dental tubules. It triggers the odontoblastic processes, and the patients get pain. Oftentimes patients will come back in and it hurts when I bite on this. And of course we run through the whole gamut of things in our minds. First thing is, check the occlusion. Could it just be reversible pulpitis from the procedure that will fade? Certainly could be. But if it's a void on the pulpal floor, that pain's going to continue. And really the only way that you can fix that is to remove that restoration, place a new restoration that doesn't have voids. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to avoid that with this material that we're going to discuss tonight. Over etching and over drying can also lead to problems. And that goes also along with incomplete bonding. Incomplete bonding can be due to a lot of things, contamination, or it could be over drying. What you want to have with adhesive dentistry, there's a bit of a zen to it. You want dentin that is moist, but you don't want it too moist. You want the dentin to be dry, but not too dry. The rule of thumb that I use is I look into my preps and I work at 5 or 5.5 magnification routinely when I'm doing my dentistry. When I look down into the prep at 5x, I want to see what looks to be moisture, but I don't want to see any puddles. If you see puddles, you've got too much moisture. But if you can look in and you can tell there's no moisture at all, now you're also going to get a weak bond. Too much water causes a decrease in bond strength. Not enough water also causes a decrease in bond strength. So those are things you need to be aware of. And the other thing, of course, is the curing light. Incomplete curing, either because the light is, it's starting to age and the output has dropped, or it could simply be that the light wasn't aimed properly, wasn't close enough to the target. There's a lot of things that can happen with the light. And unfortunately, with curing, normally what happens with a curing problem is the restoration still looks totally cured. When you touch it, with an Explorer, it feels hard, but what you don't realize is under the surface, where the restoration or the restorative material is further away from the curing light, it may not be nearly as cured as the outer layers, which were really close to the curing light. And that can lead, once again, to give of the restoration, can drive sensitivity when it's loaded, when the patient is chewing. So every time I work with adhesive dentistry, the thing that I think about are the enemies of time and contamination. And what I mean by that is, once we start the process of restoring a preparation, we start the clock on our ability to maintain that field. And it boils down to this. Basically, the number of steps we need to complete the process reacts in direct proportion to how long the process will take. So procedural steps equal time. And the more time we expend, then the greater the chance of contamination of the field. Basically, decreasing steps makes things better, faster, and easier for everybody involved: patient, doctor, and team member. How do we decrease these steps, and what do we do? If you can decrease the steps, you're going to make things better. When you're trying to control the field, if it takes you 10 steps to complete a composite, and you've got a patient who maybe they have inflamed gingival tissues and you're fighting bleeding, or maybe they're a patient that salivates a lot, and no matter what you do, you've only got a certain amount of time before saliva is going to creep up and start to get you contaminated again. The longer it takes you to do that restoration, the greater your chance of some type of contamination. So if you can decrease the number of steps, I feel that you increase your odds of success. So inversely, you decrease your steps, you also decrease your stress. It's that simple. And the other thing is, patients love efficient treatment. No patient wants dentistry to last longer. That's just not something that's going to happen in what we do. So let's talk now about this material, this Viscolor bulk. Voco has come out with a really phenomenal product here. It's a nano hybrid, but it also uses this TVT, this thermoviscous technology. And this is what we'll be discussing in the program now. It's a really novel idea from Voco, and it's not just a novel material and the components in the material that are new, but it's also the physical properties and the delivery system as well. So what the smart people at Voco have done with Viscolor, you'll notice that the name Color, it's really important to how this material handles and how well it works. Color is, it translates basically to hot, and that helps explain what we're doing with this material. It's because it's a material that is really incredible. It's designed to be used warm. Now, a lot of us in dentistry, myself included, have been using composite warmers for years. I know I have. I've probably been using warmed composite for probably 20 years of my career. And the idea with warming composite has always been that warm composite is easier to place. It is easier to sculpt. It's not as stiff. The other thing about warming the material is that when you use warm composite, the energy that's in that composite, that warmth, the molecules are moving around faster in it. And that molecular acceleration also provides better cure when things are warm. So even in normal composite materials, there are a lot of advantages to warming the material. But the people at Voco sat down and quite amazingly made a material that is designed to be heated, and that heat imparts some really incredible properties to it. And not only do you get the advantage that come with heating the composite, but along those lines with Viscolor bulk, you also get really amazing handling, ease of placement, and incredible depth of cure. I want you to take a quick look at the lower right-hand corner of that photo. You'll see the composite cartridges, and I'm going to talk about those in depth in a few slides, but I want you to take a quick peek at them because they look a little different than what you may have seen before, and there's a reason for that. So in just a moment, I'm going to get into the delivery of this material, but first I want to go over some initial facts about Viscolor bulk. It's designed to be used heated. In fact, that's the only way that it can be used. When you heat this material to around 155 degrees Fahrenheit, its viscosity is incredibly low, and that makes it simple and really easy to place. It allows for the material to penetrate into all the little nooks and crannies of the prep. A lot of doctors, when they're doing a composite, will put down an initial layer of flowable composite, or some folks will use glass ionomer. And they do that to make sure the dentin is covered and to decrease the incidence of voids on the pulpal floor. And I talked a few slides ago about how sometimes the material will stick to your instrument. It'll create a void on the pulpal floor. That can also happen if you got kind of a stiff material that maybe you can't get to go and adapt really well into the prep. And the idea here is that warming that material makes it more adaptable. So a lot of people, in an attempt to get things well adapted and to decrease the incidence of voids on the pulpal floor, they'll lay down glass ionomer or a flowable so that they don't get those voids that, that then when you load it occlusally, you get flexure of the material that then, triggers a pulpal response. So the nice thing about a material that is really easy to place and really easy to sculpt is that because it flows into all those nooks and crannies and all those hard to reach places, the dentin is covered. And that negates the need for basing with a glass ionomer or a flowable composite. So eliminating that base layer saves you steps. Saving steps saves time. You also don't need to buy the base layer material, so it saves you some money as well. If you're spending a lot of money on glass ionomers or flowable right now because of using them as base layers, you don't need to purchase those anymore. But my biggest thing on this is just the fact that it makes you efficient. It cuts the number of steps, and it helps me manage the field better because I'm not taking as long to do the restoration. Nowadays, about the only time that I place a base is when I feel that the caries is really close to the pulp. And in those situations, I won't use flowable, I won't use glass ionomer. I prefer to use a calcium hydroxide type material like Voco's Calcimol, which is a light cured calcium hydroxide base material. With Viscolor, you place it, it adapts well because it's warm, but then as this material cools, it becomes more viscous and it's incredibly easy to carve and to sculpt. The material doesn't lose these physical characteristics in a rapid manner. So as the user, the doctor has plenty of time to adapt and create the anatomy that they want to create in this. The bulk fill aspect of this material, I think, is kind of the killer app. Being able to get a 4 millimeter depth of cure with a standard curing light of about 1,000 milliwatts per square centimeter greatly increases your efficiency. And the material has great aesthetics as well. Sometimes we have to put a cap layer down on top of composites, but the aesthetics of Viscolor are such that you don't need that. This material is gorgeous. And the problem with some bulk materials is that they're manufactured to be fairly translucent. And the reason for that is the translucency allows the light, the curing light, to penetrate deeper into the restoration, which helps cure at depth. And because of that translucency, some of the bulk fill materials on the market currently aren't quite as aesthetic as we would like. Now, patients, don't really notice much, but as dentists, we see that. And we realize that the reason that they're translucent is to let those photons get to greater depths. It allows the material to set well, but it sacrifices the aesthetics. Viscolor bulk is the best of both worlds. It gives you outstanding depth of cure with what I consider to be some world-class aesthetics. And I will show you some clinical photos near the end here to show you exactly what I mean by that. So because this material is a nanohybrid, that means you can use it anywhere in the mouth in a variety of different applications. When it's warmed, it's almost a flowable, not quite, but very close to a flowable, kind of like a soft serve ice cream. But it's also tremendously aesthetic. It also has really phenomenal wear resistance, and it holds its polish over time. I've been using this material for about 15 months now, and the recare results that I'm seeing as patients come in for recare, and I'm seeing restorations that are 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 15 months. They look just as good today as they did the day I placed them. And that is a phenomenal thing in my book. One of the other things that you can use this for is core buildups. And I want to talk about that here just for a moment. When it comes to buildups, one of the things I really like is to have a buildup material that cuts like dentin. Using Viscolor bulk allows me to place a buildup really efficiently. And when I'm prepping that material, it has a dentin-like feel when I prep it. Some buildup materials are kind of soft. And the problem with that is they're softer than tooth structure, and those can be kind of easy to gouge as you're prepping them back and smoothing them up. And that leads to having to go back and then correct the divot or whatever it is that you've gotten to. So because Viscolor is easy to place and sculpt, it's really easy to prep back, and it preps just like tooth structure, so you don't end up with those divots when you're doing this. And of course, that makes things more efficient. It also gives you better retention of your final crowns. So the depth of cure of 4 millimeters is a really big deal here. One of the things that I want you all to be aware of is in the United States, about 80% of our class 2 restorations are in the range of 4 millimeters deep, 4 to 5. And in a world of conservative restorative dentistry, here's how this restoration would be done normally. So you have a 2-surface restoration here. You would prep that, and then a base layer would be to put down over the dentin, probably 1 millimeter thick, maybe a 0.5 millimeter thick. Then you would put a layer of your typical composite over that, and that increment, because of the incremental placement that we need to use with most composites, that's 2 millimeters. Then a final layer of composite is put on that, not as a capping layer, but simply because you want to make sure you're getting adequate depth of cure. So you're going to do this in 2 millimeter increments. So that final layer of composite is one more step. It could be the same composite as we used in step 2, or if you want to improve the appearance, maybe you put a dentin shade down as your first increment, and you put an enamel shade on top as your second increment. But in each of those steps, we're battling the demons that come with keeping the field under control. And in a Viscolor bulk restoration, you would apply the material in a single increment, sculpt, and cure. So this easily eliminates a minimum of 3 minutes of time by the time you factor in all the things that you've got to do. And those 3 minutes can be critical to the success or failure of the restoration, depending on how well you can control the field during that time. Now, some patients are great patients. They can stay open. They don't have, that maximal salivary flow. And for those patients, taking a few extra minutes probably isn't that big a deal. But in a lot of patients, you've got blood, crevicular fluid, and saliva that you are battling constantly, and saving those steps makes things go much faster, gives you a much better chance of having long-term clinical success. So this is how easy it is to use Viscolor bulk. There are different ways to warm it, and I'll show you those here in just a moment. Basically, you place it, you warm it, you place it in the prep, you sculpt it, and you cure it. One shot, 4 millimeters, place, sculpt, cure, done. It's that easy. It's a phenomenal material. So this is an infrared image of the actual composite capsule. And you can see in this image that the red indicates the greatest amount of heat, and you can see how that material maintains its warmth and its flowability as it exits that tip and it goes down into the preparation. You can also see how it starts to dissipate just a little bit once it gets into the prep. And that's where the material goes from the kind of soft serve ice cream viscosity into that creamy sculptable viscosity. And that also obviously makes things more efficient because it's easy to place, but then as it cools ever so slightly, it's also easy to carve and easy to sculpt. So I'd like to show you really quickly here a video, and I'm just going to do a little voiceover here as it runs, because what I want you to be able to see here is just with Viscolor, the warming that takes place. Oh, hang on a second. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back one slide, go to this. Because what I've done with this is I want you to be able to see the warming gun and then just see how, when we've got the warming gun running, how it works. So here we go. This is one of the ways to use Viscolor, and this is the barrel of the dispenser. There are LEDs in that barrel. So here's the cartridge, put the cartridge in, and then you press the on button on the gun. And what you'll see here, now I'm going to press the button, and you'll see that the handle has an LED ribbon in it, and it begins to blink. So with the Viscolor capsule, it's got a small diameter and it's a lot longer. So that allows the tip to go all the way down into the bottom of the box. And when that tip is actually in contact with the floor of the box, you can express the material while you keep that tip constantly immersed in the composite. And that creates an environment of very few voids, while also increasing the efficiency because you're doing it in a bulk fill type situation. So that tip that's being thin and long, it can easily be placed all the way down. And then the low viscosity of the material lends itself to flowing into all the nooks and crannies, and you don't have the material stick to the capsule and then coming out when you pull your dispenser away. So it's a lot easier with this compule than ever before. It gets down into the proximal box. One thing you think about, I've actually measured composite compules, and the one from Viscolor, the Viscolor compule is about 2 millimeters in diameter at the tip, but others are around 2 3/4 to 4 millimeters. And those large diameters usually don't fit, way down into those proximal boxes. So there's the Viscolor tip. And then you look at just other regular composite cartridges that I had laying around my office. once again, the Viscolor tip, and you can see how long and thin that tip is. And that's what allows you to get into all those nice little areas. Not so much with that one. And you can see Viscolor at top, a couple of others on down, and all of those bottom two don't go down into the prep nearly as well as that thin kind of hummingbird beak kind of form that the Viscolor does, which is really, really nice. Now, this material has 4 shades. And when I first heard that, I thought 4 shades might be a limiting factor for me. But after using this material in a lot of restorations, what I've found is that these shades are perfectly adequate. They match really well, and that makes the inventory much easier to keep track of. Composite shades are getting a lot less complicated, thank God. I mean, that's one of the best things that we've had lately in dentistry is we're decreasing the number of shades in composite. Nobody wants to buy extra material that expires and gets thrown away, and that you only keep around just in case of that one really oddball restoration color that comes into your office every 2 or 3 years. The days of having to buy, dozens of colors, thank goodness, are over. Trust me when I say that keeping track of the inventory of 4 shades is a whole lot easier than trying to keep track of the inventory of 15 shades. Viscolor does a really incredible job of picking up on the shade of the surrounding tooth structure to create a really nice chameleon effect. So this is the gun, and there's 2 ways to heat Viscolor. One is in this gun, and the other is in a heater. So when you switch this on, it takes it 30 seconds to warm the compule up to 150 degrees, and then it will maintain that temperature for 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and then the blue light will turn off, and the battery itself is good for 15 or 20 capsules. So it's a quick, easy thing to do. What I do is I have it all out. I have the cartridge preloaded in the gun, and when I start the bonding procedure, when my assistant starts to isolate, that's when I hit the button on the dispenser gun, and by the time we are actually ready for composite, it's gone through that 30-second warm-up cycle. The other thing that I did was I bought a couple of extra batteries for the gun, and I bought this battery charger off of Amazon. So I just keep spare batteries charged all the time. So if I start a procedure and I notice that the battery is getting low, I can just quickly switch it over and go to a different battery. You can actually charge the gun directly. There's a USB port in the gun that you can plug into an outlet, and you can just charge the gun overnight if you want to. I find sometimes in a busy day when I've really been seeing a lot of patients, I like having a spare battery charged and not having to plug it in during my work day. But that's just the way I work. Your mileage may vary with this. The other thing I want you to look at with this is when you look at the Viscolor flowability with this, and you look at this viscosity shift, it has an incredible amount of shift as far as how easy it is to place. Warming normal composite, it doesn't go through the same phase change that Viscolor does. So I know a lot of you out there are warming composite every day in your offices, and you're probably saying, well, I'm already warming composite, John. What's the big deal about this? I'll just continue to warm whatever I've got. This is made to be warmed, and it, like I said, it comes out in that little tiny tip like soft serve ice cream. It's a lot easier to place than any other material on the market, and I have tried a bunch over the years with warming. So there's lots of technological advancement that went into making Viscolor bulk. The chemistry it's very unique. It's first of its kind. It utilizes a new monomer system that Voco created and a chemical structure that lowers its melting point, and that's what really gives it that thermoviscous technology. They followed that by using a new filler technology and a new silane coating that further manipulates the materials, and it creates that incredible viscosity change. And that's what really gives it that handling characteristics. It's not just the fact that it's a warm composite, it's a composite that was designed to be used warm. And there's a difference between just any kind of composite and viscolor bulk. So this is the LEDs in the barrel of the gun. There's a photo of them. You can't actually see the LEDs when they're warming, but your camera can. And so this photo simply shows the infrared energy coming off of those LEDs, and that's what warms that cartridge when it's in the gun. Now, the company also makes a composite warmer, which you can use instead. I happen to prefer the gun. I love the fact that when I'm using the dispenser gun, I know that the material, as it's exiting that dispenser gun, it is going where I want it to go, and it's easier for me to control. And I know that it's coming out of that dispenser at 150 degrees. With the warmer, when you take it off the warmer, it does start to cool. It's not a design flaw. You can certainly use it that way. I just find that having the dispenser gun makes things easier for me. So this is the difference here between the caps warmer and the dispenser gun. The caps warmer, you've got to start it first thing in the morning because it takes about 20 minutes to get to the initial warm temperature. And then it takes about 3 minutes for you to put a capsule in there. Now, if you've got this sitting on your operatory counter and you start it every morning with 4 capsules in it, you don't have to wait that 3 minutes to warm a cap. Once the base is warm, then your material is warm as well. But I like the fact that the gun heats up quickly, and as I dispense it, I know that I've got the material coming out at the right temp. One disadvantage is if I swap cartridges, I've got to warm that next cartridge up, which you don't have to do in the heater. So it's a bit of advantage of the heater with that for multiple capsules. What I do is I will usually do a couple of restorations. Then I'll switch. If I need to do more, if I'm doing a quadrant, I'll do a couple of restorations with the gun. I will then take the cartridge out, put a new cartridge in, give it 30 seconds to warm up, and then continue. But you can do it either way. It doesn't, and both work. So there's no reason to choose really one over the other. It's more just the way you choose to practice. Little technical data on filler percentages. So this is basically a really highly filled composite that Voco has made. And that decreases a lot of your shrinkage stresses and such. The concept behind composites is this picture, which is the white is resin and those light blue little ellipses and dots, that's filler material. The more filler material you have, the less resin, which is the white, that you have, the less shrinkage you get. So highly filled materials polish better and they shrink less. So there's something to really be said about having a really intensely filled material that helps decrease the amount of shrinkage. And you can see that in this particular slide where you're seeing that Viscolor is really, really on this bar graph, a very low shrinkage material as opposed to other composites that are on the market. It also has really high compressive strength, so it doesn't fracture. One of the other things I'll say too about that shrinkage factor is that also helps decrease the incidence of sensitivity because you're not pulling the cusps in with things like that. Water uptake in micrograms per cubic millimeter, very low water uptake of this material, which, the micro hardness is very, very good with this as well. So you can see that it's a really good material, even from the chemical and the physics side of it. So some people, I'm sure, will probably ask, though, John, if you're taking something that's 150 degrees and you're putting it close to the pulp, could that cause pulpal inflammation? Well, Voco tested this out. They had a doctor in Germany actually figured this out. This is an extracted tooth, and those two tips at the apex here are actually flowing water through the pulp chamber to kind of simulate blood flow through the tooth. And then they've measured this as far as like the amount of energy and the heat that the pulp will absorb and such. And so this is light curing the material after you've placed the warm material in here, and you'll see that on that lower left-hand side of that slide, the tooth temperature cannot exceed 105.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And you'll notice where it says pulp chamber here, you got 101 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're well below the number down here that you would want to avoid to cause any kinds of pulpal inflammation, whether from the material or from the curing of the material. So I do not have problems with any kind of sensitivity in using this. So here's the placement. This is how I like to do this. I prefer to use a 5th generation approach, which is a total etch and then a prime and bond in a single step. The 4th generation is primer in one step and a bonding agent in a separate step. So what I do is I etch with phosphoric acid, I wash, I dry, I leave the dentin moist. Then I apply Future Bond U and I scrub that into the prep. One of the things I love about Future Bond U is that it's unidose. And so every time I go to use it, I get a fresh pack, which I know is good chemistry, and I don't have to worry about chemistry weakening or aging. Then you put a gentle stream of air on there for 10 or 15 seconds, and that removes the solvent from the bonding agent. Cure for 10 seconds, and then dispense your Viscolor bulk. You condense that and sculpt it in 4 millimeter increments, and then you set it. One of the other things I like are the occlusionator instruments from Pat Retzinger. This is kind of an interesting instrument. It's got a lot of different tips on it, and Pat sells these himself. I like them a lot. They're very, very easy to use. I also like his occlusionator burr kit because they're, as you can see in this close-up view, really great to put in your anatomy and then smooth it up as well. So let's now look at the clinical results. I promised you I'd show you some clinicals. This was a nice one that I want to tell you about, where I was using this material and I just had a few cartridges, and we took the shade, and it was an A2, and this is when I first started using Viscolor bulk, and we got ready to fill it, and we suddenly realized we didn't have any A2. And I said, all right, let's use A1 instead. And if it looks this good, if I made a mistake with the shade, imagine how good it looks if you've got the right material or the right shade. You get results like this. This stuff, I will say, hands down, is the most aesthetic composite material that I have ever used. And I have used dozens of composites over the years. Now this one, this was a mesial and a distal slot prep. I didn't get a preoperative one on this. Obviously, this is after we've checked the occlusion. This next picture is actually the first premolar, which also had a distal slot prep on this. And you can see how well this material blends. It just picks up the surrounding colors phenomenally. And you know, these camera pictures are taken at about 32x, and you really struggle to see the restorations. And that's not because I'm some, phenomenal cosmetic operator. It's completely due to the material that I'm using, and it's a phenomenal material. So I want to thank you all for being with me. Thanks to Voco again for for sponsoring this lecture. I appreciate the time that you all spent with me. We've got about 5 minutes or 4 minutes left for Q&A. There is my contact info if you need it. Email is always the best, jflukie@dentical.com, but my social media handles are there as well. And then we'll, if you all have any questions, then we certainly can do that as well. Take that away, go to Q&A. Okay, so I've got a question here. It says, for deep preps, do you ever use Gluma to reduce sensitivity? Yes, I do. I'm a big fan of Gluma. I don't use it in every case, but we use it frequently. And especially if I have a deeper restoration, we go to Gluma. I do have some patients, and I'm sure we probably all do have some patients where anytime I do a restoration, I know that we're going to get some type of pulpal inflammation and they're going to be sensitive. And for those folks, we just default to Gluma every time. And it works really, really well. I'm a big fan of Gluma. Got one question here about debonding. I haven't really had any problems with that in deeper restorations. This material, like I said, I've been using it for about between 15 to 18 months now. Everything looks good clinically. Got a question, any experience in using this with pediatric patients? Yes, I have, and it has worked really well in pediatric patients. Biggest problem that I have with pediatric dentistry is simply keeping the field dry. Little mouths and lots of slobber do not a great composite make. So when I say that I've had good results with it, I will say I've had good results, but I'm also pretty judicious about who I use it on. A lot of kids in my office end up with glass ionomer restorations, but on older kids or kids that I know I can really manage well and manage the field well, I've used Viscalor bulk and I've had really good results with it. So folks, that's the Q&A. I appreciate it. Thank you all so much for being with me tonight. I highly recommend, like I said, I've got 15 to 18 months in with this material, and it is still, in that amount of time, after about a year and a half, it is still the most aesthetic material that I have ever used. And I don't say that lightly, but I love picking this up and using it on a regular basis in my practice. It's made me a better dentist, and I think it's really benefited my patients. So thank you all very much for joining me.